it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini. I post weekly crafting, cooking, and organic gardening videos right here on my YouTube channel. In this video, I'm teaching you how to make sashing strips, cornerstones, and how to attach them to your quilt blocks. So the next step in putting together our quilt top is going to be to add these sashing strips. And sashing strips are basically just strips of fabric that you're going to use to frame out each of the individual blocks. And I especially like to do this when I'm working on a quilt that has a lot of different fabrics, whether you're using them from your scrap bins or if you're using a line like this Victorian Modern line that has so many different prints that you can use and that go nicely together. So we're going to use these strips and these little cornerstones. They're called cornerstones because they're little squares that obviously go on the corners, okay? And we're going to use these to frame out each one of our 12 blocks. So before we start working on cutting out fabric for the sashing strips and cornerstones, we need to make sure that we have 12 blocks that measure exactly the same, regardless of whether it measures the actual 16.5 inches by 16.5 inches that it's supposed to be or not. So what I want you to do is to take your ruler and measure every single one of your blocks and take notes and say, okay, this one's 16.5 by 16.5. Okay, mine are pretty much all dead on. I've already measured them ahead of time, so I don't really have to trim mine down. But say you're not too experienced working with the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, or for some reason, who knows why, you've ended up with blocks that measure 16.25 inches square or less, right? Whatever it is, don't worry about it. All I want you to do is find the smallest block in your stash of 12, and then I want you to trim the rest of them down to match with that size. Just make sure that it's square, okay? You want the same dimensions, both on the length and the width. So even if you end up trimming them all down to 16 inches square, that's fine. Your quilt is still going to be okay. But what we need to have are 12 identically sized blocks so that we make sure that we're cutting out our sashing strips and cornerstones to match. Otherwise, it's not all going to come together. So once you have 12 blocks that measure the exact same thing, we're ready to start cutting out our sashing fabric. So first we're going to start off with our strips, and this is the fabric that we'll be using for the sashing strips. My fabric is nice and pressed. I'm going to start just like we've been doing. Start off with a nice clean cut edge. I'm lining up a line on my ruler with the fold of my fabric down here. So what I'm going to do is just measure the 3 inches in this direction and cut that way. So let me get my smaller ruler here. 3 inches. Okay. Now because I've cut the 3 inches measuring this way, that means that from this folded up strip, I need to cut my 16.5 inches. And just from the measurements, I'll tell you that you'll only be able to cut out 2 of the sashing strips that we need, right, cut to size from each one of these. So I've cut 5 strips already, but now I can see for the next one, you see how I have barely any fabric down here, and all the way at the top there I have maybe even like about 1/2 inch. That means that my edge here has gotten thrown off as I've been cutting. So whenever you notice that, all you need to do is just line this up again, make it so that it's a straight edge just like you did at the beginning to prep your fabric, and then just cut that off to get a nice straight edge. So I have my 16 strips. Now I need to go back and cut this into chunks of 16.5 inches. You can see I'm cutting off the selvage there completely. So after you cut that, then I'm just going to flip this around, and from that edge I'm now going to measure 16.5 inches. And to do that, I've laid now my ruler so that the 16.5 inch mark is right on that freshly cut edge of my strip. So now I know that from the 16.5 inch mark all the way down to 0, the strip that's underneath the ruler is what I need. So I can cut right here. And so what we get here now are 2 strips cut to the size that we need. So you're going to repeat that to all of your strips here. So now that I've cut up all my strips, the total is 32, so you can take one and set it aside because you're only going to need 31 of these for this quilt top. So before you cut your strips, keep in mind that if you trim down your quilt blocks to smaller than the 16.5 inches square that I have here, you want to cut them so that it matches up with the dimensions of your quilt block. So I've cut mine 3 inches by 16.5. So if yours is 16.25, make sure that these strips only measure the 16.25 as well. Now we're ready to cut our fabric for our cornerstones, and this is the fabric that we're using. Okay, you should still have some of this left. I'm gonna trim off here to get started on a freshly cut edge. And then we're just gonna need 20 little squares that are cut to 3 inches by 3 inches. So real simple. Cut a 3-inch wide strip here. From these 2 strips, we're going to cut off the selvage. And now I'm going to cut out 3-inch increments from each one of these. So let me turn it this way. So I have the fold on this side, the freshly cut edge here. And so I'm just going to go cutting 3-inch blocks. So 3-inch by 3 inches this way. You have 2. And continue to do that till you get 20. So here are all the pieces of fabric that you're going to need to put together the entire quilt top. We have our 12 quilt blocks, our sashing strips, and the cornerstones. So the first step in putting together the sashing is going to be to sew one of these strips to any one of the 4 sides of each block. You're only sewing it to one side. So I'll take this one here, and I'm just going to pick this side. So I'm going to put this here, and I'm going to sew one of these sashing strips to one edge of each one of my blocks, okay? All the blocks are completely symmetrical, so it's not going to make a difference which side you sew it to, but you only want to add one strip to one side of the block. And I'm pushing the seam allowance towards the sashing strip, so it's going that way, behind the sashing strip, okay? Now from all your cut strips and cornerstone squares, I want you to create the following. You need 12 units that look just like this, okay? So you're going to grab 12 strips, 12 squares, and you're going to sew one to just one of the short ends of your strip, okay? So I want 12 and set those aside. Then I also want you to create 4 units that look just like this, okay? So notice it's a strip, but we have 2 cornerstones on the ends, all right? So you need 4 that look just like this one. So after we've stitched down just the one strip, right? We stitch one strip of the sashing to the right side or to any of the 4 sides of every single one of our blocks. Once we've done that for every block, then lay out your blocks exactly how you want them to look. And once you have the finished orientation, what I want you to do is then decide on the one side that doesn't have the strips, right? Because I sewed this to the right side of each of those blocks. So when we get down there, we have the last one, but then the beginning of this one didn't have this one. So you go ahead and get another strip and add it to the left side of just these 3 blocks so that we end up with one of these sashing strips on either side of both of the blocks on the ends and then also in between, right? Because we need all these strips to frame out every single block on our quilt top. So now the next step is, once you've cut out the rest of your sashing pieces, I have the ones here that are just the sashing strip and 1 cornerstone, and then I have the other ones that have the sashing strip and the 2 cornerstones. So the ones with 2 cornerstones are going to be on this end, right? Because we don't have a block on this side and we still need to have the exact same thing going for each one. So you should only have 4 of these, and these go here. And then the remaining blocks, you're just going to orient them so that they fit in between and fill in all your spaces. So one there, and don't forget that you need them at the top and at the bottom, okay? They completely need to frame out your squares. So I just like to do it like this on a design wall because it allows for me to see it visually exactly how it's going to come together so that I don't just go straight to my sewing machine and sew and then end up making a mistake. So this is exactly what your finished quilt top should look like. Now we just need to sew the strips into their places. So to do that, I don't want you to stitch across in rows. Instead, we're going to stitch to each individual block. This is going to allow us to get nice crisp points at all these different intersecting areas, okay? So what I want you to do here is stitch this to this block, okay? Stitch this to this block, just like that in sections, okay? This to this block, and then the same thing with this one up here to this block, all right? Then I would go back and stitch these units together to form one full row, and we'd be done with that. Then you just scoot over to the next one. Stitch here to this block, stitch this strip to this block, this to here, this strip to this block again, and then just unite the units. So again, just basically stitch the sashing strips with one cornerstone to the block that's directly underneath it until you get to the end, and then you want to stitch the sashing strip that's at the bottom to the other side of this block as well. And then I would do that and then stitch this full thing together. And so you basically will end up putting together 4 different strips like that. Then I would just take like these 2, stitch them together, those 2, stitch them together. And then take these 2 and stitch the whole thing down the center right there. So I did some sewing and I just wanted to show you a sample of what one of the completed rows would look like. You see this whole thing is all stitched together, and I would repeat the same thing to get 4 strips the same way, and then just add the strips together. So now I'm off to go do my sewing homework so I can get this quilt top finished off. I hope that you'll give this quilt along a try, and I'll see you next week where I'll be talking about batting, backing, and how we put this whole thing together to create an actual quilt. And now here's the information on last week's giveaway winners. And now for the details on the last giveaway of this Victorian Modern Quilt Along series. Fiskars has been kind enough to offer up a great little rotary cutting set. So here's what one of you viewers is going to be winning. This is the new Fiskars Ergo Control rotary cutter, the one that I've been using throughout this entire series, and then also the corresponding mat. It's 2 feet by 3 feet, which is a great size, and it's reversible. So once one side gets used up, which will probably take you years, you can just flip it over and use the other side, okay? So all you need to do to enter is if you enjoyed this video tutorial, go ahead and hit it with the thumbs up below, share it across the different social media sites, and don't forget to click that subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of my new video tutorials. If you're coming across this tutorial randomly and you're wanting to find out what this quilt along is all about, make sure that you click right here and I'll send you to the beginning of the video series.